The California sky shimmered with the last pale gold of afternoon, the kind of honey-colored light that blanketed the hillsides and turned even cracked pavement into something soft, something beautiful. The city had paused in that brief, tender moment between traffic snarls and twilight, when the chaos of rush hour had not yet crested and the city seemed to hold its breath. Kamala Harris sat in the back of her black Suburban, her posture upright but softened by the rhythm of the road. The hum of tires on asphalt blended with the occasional burst of static from the radio, where Secret Service agents relayed instructions and route confirmations in practiced monotone. To anyone watching from the sidewalks, it was another impenetrable procession: black SUVs, tinted windows, an expressionless cordon of power carving through Los Angeles like a blade. But inside the vehicle, Kamala wasn't absorbed in politics or policy briefings. Her tablet sat unopened beside her. Her mind wandered. Something about the day had felled off, an ache she couldn't quite name pressing at the base of her ribs. Maybe it was the weight of her morning visit to a hospital where exhausted nurses smiled with their eyes over N95 masks. Maybe it was the silent look exchanged with a single mother clutching her infant in a hallway lined with folding chairs. She turned her gaze to the window, allowing herself a rare moment of reflection. As the motorcade swept down South Central's Jefferson Boulevard, the scenery grew rougher around the edges. Buildings were set like scars. Corner stores sat shuttered beneath graffiti-stained awnings. Yet beneath the cracked sidewalks and weary architecture, there was something alive. Children with basketballs in hand, an old man tending a patch of green by a broken fence, the scent of tamales rising faintly from an alley cart. Then she saw them. Near the intersection where Florence met Avalon, a family huddled on the edge of a vacant lot. The concrete was damp, stained with the history of storms past. A blue tarp, tattered and thin, had been tied clumsily between two bent poles. It flapped weakly in the breeze, offering little protection from the evening air. A woman, no older than Kamala herself, crouched beside a boy who could not have been older than 7. His socks were mismatched and full of holes. Beside them, a teenage girl sat on an upturned bucket, staring vacantly ahead. Her arms wrapped protectively around a plastic bag filled with what looked like old books and a small, worn teddy bear. Kamala's heart gave a sharp, quiet tug. She leaned closer to the window. The image, so ordinary in its tragedy, seemed to slow time itself. "Stop," she said aloud, startling the aide seated across from her. "Ma'am," came the uncertain reply. "Tell the driver to stop. Now." The SUV came to an abrupt halt, forcing the vehicles behind to respond in a staggered cascade. Within seconds, agents stirred to life, eyes scanning, muscles tensing, unsure what had prompted the Vice President's sudden command. But Kamala had already opened the door. The cool air rushed in, carrying the city's scent, a mix of diesel, sweat, and sun-dried dust. She stepped onto the pavement in tailored heels that clicked against the broken sidewalk like a heartbeat. The city seemed to draw a breath around her. From a nearby bodega, a man paused mid-sweep, mouth agape. Across the street, a group of teenagers stopped their laughter. But Kamala didn't notice the growing attention. She was walking, slowly but without hesitation, toward the family in the lot. The mother looked up first, eyes wide, fear rising like smoke behind them. She pulled the boy close, shielding him instinctively. The girl beside her tensed. Kamala stopped a few feet away, hands visible and empty, her face soft. She didn't speak. Not yet. Instead, she let the silence unfold, let her presence speak for itself. There was no press, no flashing cameras, just a woman who had once walked these streets as a child, now standing before a family that reminded her painfully of what too many forgot. She lowered herself onto her knees, the cold ground biting through the fabric of her suit. She met the mother's gaze, not with pity, but with something far rarer, recognition. This wasn't politics. This was a moment made entirely of humanity. Behind her, the Secret Service hesitated, confused, unsure of protocol in such uncharted terrain. But Kamala waved them off with a glance. She didn't need protection here. She needed connection. She looked at the boy, whose small face was streaked with dirt, but whose eyes sparkled with something defiant. Curiosity, perhaps, or the last fragile shard of hope. A half-eaten orange rested beside his foot. He was too cold to shiver, too proud to cry. Kamala blinked against the sting rising in her eyes. The mother spoke first, barely a whisper, apologetic in its trembling tone, but Kamala gently shook her head. She didn't need explanations. She only needed truth. And it was all here, laid bare beneath a fraying tarp. Poverty wrapped in resilience, loss hidden behind the shield of maternal instinct, dignity stretched thin but not broken. From the corner of her eye, she noticed a paper sign propped against a crate, written in uneven capital letters with a fading marker. Home lost a fire. Need help? Anything helps, God bless. Kamala exhaled. It wasn't the fire that had broken them, she knew. It was the aftermath, the forgotten days, the unreturned calls, the slow erosion of visibility. They hadn't just lost a home. They'd lost their place in the world's gaze. But not today. Today, someone had seen them. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew her personal wallet, not the one prepared by aides with tidy business cards and ceremonial gestures. The leather was worn, the contents personal. She pulled out cash, several bills, folded without fanfare, and extended them gently. But more than that, she reached for the mother's hand. It was rough and calloused, trembling as it met Kamala's, but did not pull away. Their fingers intertwined for a moment that felt suspended in time. Two women, two mothers, two souls recognizing each other across the divide of circumstance. Kamala squeezed once, then stood. Without turning to her staff, she spoke softly but with quiet authority. Give me a contact at the County Housing Authority. Tonight. No didas. I want shelter arranged. Medical checkups, too. And food. Hot food. Now. The agents nodded, already moving. As Kamala returned to her vehicle, the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the broken lot like fingers reaching toward the future. Behind her, the mother clutched the bills to her chest, not out of greed but gratitude. A lifeline had been thrown, not just of money, but of visibility, of dignity restored. Kamala paused before stepping into the SUV. She looked back once. The boy waved, and she smiled. Not the practiced smile of podiums and photo ops, but something quieter, deeper. She had not saved them. Not yet, but she had stopped. And sometimes, stopping was the first step toward everything. The motorcade moved again, this time slower, with a quietness that seemed to acknowledge something sacred had just occurred. As the vehicles resumed their route, the usual chatter over earpieces faded, replaced by a subdued energy, like a choir that had fallen reverently silent after the final note. Inside her vehicle, Kamala Harris sat in stillness, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the reflections in the tinted glass window. Though the city unfolded around her in its usual chaos, vendors shouting, traffic lights blinking with mechanical indifference, horns scattering birds into flight, her thoughts remained tethered to that cracked corner lot, where a mother had whispered thanks without sound, and a child had waved with a hand that trembled slightly but held fast to hope. That moment had shifted something inside her, not as vice president, not as a politician, but as a woman who still remembered the scent of warm tamales in her grandmother's kitchen and the creak of wooden steps in her modest Oakland childhood home. Her aide, sitting across from her, tapped on a tablet, his fingers moving with urgency as he coordinated with staff back in Washington and local Los Angeles agencies. Kamala didn't interrupt him, but she didn't need to. Her presence alone had already activated a cascade of action that would, in the hours ahead, transform that makeshift shelter into something safer, warmer, and more dignified. Behind them, reporters who had been following the motorcade from a distance began piecing together fragments of the story. A sudden, unplanned stop, a brief appearance on foot, a family in distress. It wasn't yet news, not officially, but something about the spontaneity of the event, something about the vice president kneeling on broken concrete, had started to spread like the first soft murmur of an incoming tide. Down the street from the vacant lot, a man in a red beanie who had been fixing a rusted bicycle chain whispered to a friend in disbelief. At the gas station 2 blocks over, a cashier repeated the story to a customer who blinked twice in surprise before muttering, "That can't be true." In the window of a laundromat, an elderly woman folding bedsheets stared out toward the corner lot, her face etched with memory, wondering if she had really seen who she thought she had. The story passed not through headlines, not through bold print declarations, but in hushes and hand gestures, the way always travels, slow, circular, and full of reverence. By nightfall, the family had been relocated to a temporary housing unit on the edge of the city, small but warm, clean, and safe. Volunteers had arrived almost instinctively, some offering blankets, others bringing soup, others still just wanted to sit and listen. The mother, whose name was Celia, had barely spoken at first, her voice frayed by too many nights of explaining, too many days of being unseen. But as the light returned to her eyes and her children's laughter echoed against the walls of their new room, something within her began to ease. She hadn't expected a miracle. She had stopped asking for 1 week ago. What she had longed for, instead, was acknowledgement, someone to see her pain and not look away. Kamala's gesture, as simple as it had been, had done just that. It had cracked the wall of invisibility that poverty builds around people, brick by brick, until no one remembers who lives behind it. Meanwhile, back in her residence, Kamala stood at the window, the city lights flickering below like stars fallen to earth. She had returned from the event she'd been scheduled to attend, an infrastructure summit, important in its own right, but less vital than the silent, improvised ceremony that had taken place beside the tarp. Her heels were off, her blazer hung neatly over a chair, and the low hum of jazz music filtered softly from another room. She cradled a mug of tea between her palms, its warmth bleeding into her skin as her mind replayed the encounter. She hadn't done it for cameras. In truth, she had forgotten the cameras altogether. It had been instinct, a thread of memory from long ago, when her mother had once told her that dignity wasn't something you earned, but something you preserved in others. Downstairs, her staff moved briskly between calls and correspondence, trying to decide how to officially frame the incident. Should there be a press release? A social media statement? A quote from the Vice President? Kamala had instructed them not to turn it into a spectacle. She didn't want the moment to be reduced to hashtags or viral headlines. What mattered was not how loudly the story was told, but how deeply it settled into the collective conscience. And yet, despite her wishes for silence, the ripples continued. At a nearby high school, a student wrote an essay about the woman on the sidewalk and the politician who had paused her entire day to kneel beside her. The teacher, moved by the piece, read it aloud to the class, and by the time she reached the final sentence, half the room sat in silence, staring down at their desks, unsure whether they were feeling sadness, hope, or both. In a neighborhood church, the pastor mentioned the incident during his sermon, not in grand detail, but as a question. When was the last time you stopped for someone not because it was required, but because your heart demanded it? His voice trembled slightly on the final words, and no one in the pews looked at their watches during the rest of the service. The family, now adjusting to their new surroundings, had begun speaking to social workers. The mother, Celia, expressed a quiet desire to return to her former job in elder care. Her daughter had begun writing again, filling the blank pages of a notebook found in a donation box with stories, half fiction, half memory, about a woman in a suit who walked like a storm and smiled like spring. The boy, now sleeping on a real mattress for the first time in months, had begun asking questions about the world again. It was not a solution to everything. Poverty would not vanish because of a single act. Injustice would not crumble overnight. But within that corner of the city, something had shifted, something deep, human, and irreversible. Kamala Harris had reminded them, without ever saying the words, that sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is stop. Not to give a speech, not to pose for a photograph, but simply to kneel, to listen, to offer warmth not as a performance, but as a promise. And the city, bruised and hardened though it was, had felt it. Like a long-forgotten melody suddenly recalled, the people who watched, or heard, or merely felt, remembered that leadership could look like this too. Not loud, not grand, but breathtakingly human. Far from the cracked sidewalks of Los Angeles, where a mother's silent plea had stirred something ancient in the soul of a nation, the polished corridors of Washington buzzed with a subtler intensity. News of Kamala Harris's unexpected detour, her quiet moment beneath the tattered tarp of a broken family shelter, had trickled into Capitol Hill not as a roar, but as a murmur that refused to be ignored. It began in aides' inboxes and group chats, the way all things modern and consequential often do. Most politicians, swept up in legislative sessions and midterm strategies, barely glanced at the initial headlines. But then came the images, fuzzy, unplanned, and taken from the trembling hands of bystanders whose cameras shook not from excitement, but reverence. There she was, the Vice President of the United States, crouched beside a child on a damp corner lot, her tailored slacks marked by dust, her hand resting gently on a trembling shoulder. No press was called, no statements were issued, and yet the photo spread faster than most press releases ever could. Within hours, the images had made their way to newsrooms, not through official press wires, but from the uploads of street vendors, students, and a retired nurse who had captured the moment while sitting on a nearby bench. Unlike orchestrated photo ops, this moment was raw, candid, and deeply personal. It was the kind of image that didn't scream, but stayed. It whispered of something that politics rarely offers anymore: sincerity. In the West Wing, whispers grew into measured conversations. Advisors debated the ramifications. Should they embrace the moment, build upon it, draft a statement to reinforce her humanity? Or should they let it fade naturally, worried that any attempt to formalize it might dilute its raw power? Kamala had already answered that question, without words, but with a firmness that resonated among those closest to her. No press kits, no grand speeches, no parade of talking points to recite. What she had done in South Central was not an event to capitalize on. It was a human moment that demanded preservation, not packaging. But still, the ripple reached them. Late into the evening, after a round of back-to-back meetings, Kamala sat in the quiet of her study, a soft lamp casting amber light across stacks of folders she no longer had the will to read. She turned instead to her notebook, the one she kept not for schedules or speeches, but for thoughts too fragile for headlines. She wrote slowly, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew it mattered that the words be written carefully. She wasn't crafting a policy. She was shaping a promise. "We cannot continue to pass the invisible," she wrote, "without understanding that every person we ignore becomes a wound in the fabric of this nation." That night, she made a decision. It wouldn't be a sweeping legislative overhaul, not yet, but it would be a spark, a new pilot program, modest at first, but alive with potential, designed not by lobbyists in boardrooms, but by people who had lived beneath tarps, slept in shelters, and known the ache of being unseen. The announcement would come quietly at a town hall, not from a podium flanked by flags, but from a folding chair in a community center that smelled faintly of floor wax and old coffee. She would share the story without embellishment. A woman, a child, a tarp, a moment of truth. In the days that followed, cities across the country began organizing small events in response. Not political rallies, but gatherings of neighbors in parks and libraries, where people shared their own encounters with invisibility. Teachers spoke of students who slept in cars. Nurses remembered patients who listed shelters as their home addresses. Volunteers who had faded into the background were invited to the front of the room, handed the mic, and asked to speak. Across digital platforms, the story refused to fade. It didn't trend in the way celebrity scandals or political missteps often did. Instead, it endured. Parents showed their children the photo and whispered, "This is what compassion looks like." College students included it in ethics essays. A muralist in San Diego painted a child with his hand raised in silent gratitude, a shadowy figure behind him kneeling in soft, solemn dignity. And in the offices of skeptics, those who had long dismissed Kamala Harris as overly polished or politically calculated. There was a shift, subtle but undeniable. They didn't all agree with her, but they paused. And sometimes, a pause is more powerful than applause. Within the policy circles, the proposed pilot program began to take shape. It wasn't just another housing initiative. It was rooted in presence. It called for mobile response units not to issue citations or enforce compliance, but to offer medical assistance, therapy, and most critically, human connection. Outreach teams would be trained not only in logistics, but in empathy. They would learn not just how to assess needs, but how to look someone in the eyes and mean it when they said, "You matter." As Kamala prepared her notes for the upcoming town hall, she didn't rehearse. She didn't bullet point. She simply read the letter that had arrived the day after her visit. A note from the girl she had met in that broken lot. "Thank you for seeing us," the child wrote in careful, slanted handwriting. "Everyone walks by, but you stopped." She folded the letter slowly, pressing her fingers over the paper as if trying to absorb every ounce of its meaning. There are speeches that shape policy. There are moments that shift power. But there are also pauses in the noise, unspoken exchanges that ripple outward not in sound, but in feeling. And this was one of them. What had begun as a spontaneous act had evolved into something else entirely. Not a movement led by slogans or banners, but a quiet, consistent call to remember the humanity of those we walk past each day. In that stillness, in that unanticipated act of simply stopping, Kamala Harris had done something few in leadership ever manage. She had reminded a nation that sometimes the most profound form of power is presence. And in doing so, she had planted something deeper than policy, something rooted not in legislation, but in love. The days that followed Kamala Harris's unexpected visit to the crumbling lot on Jefferson Boulevard moved with an unusual rhythm, slower in some ways, as if the city itself were still catching its breath, and faster in others, like hope running ahead, urging change to keep up. For the family she met there, Celia, her teenage daughter Marisol, and 7-year-old Isaiah, life had begun to shift in ways they never could have imagined when they'd first huddled beneath a torn tarp, waiting for the cold to pass. Their temporary shelter, arranged quietly but swiftly, had been the first step. Though small and plain, the apartment felt like a palace to Isaiah, who spent the first night crawling across the carpet simply because it was soft, warm, and his. Celia had cried in the bathroom, not from grief this time, but from something far more overwhelming, relief. The kind that makes your body tremble when the burden of months finally slips from your shoulders. Volunteers had continued to visit, not just bringing supplies, but offering conversation, listening to the family's stories without judgment, and encouraging Celia to imagine something she hadn't dared to in years: stability. One woman, a retired caseworker named Lorraine, came every afternoon with groceries and quiet wisdom. She helped Celia sort through the paperwork required to apply for permanent housing, medical assistance, and even job training. What began as an act of aid became something more personal. A friendship formed from the shared understanding that the road back from brokenness is never walked alone. Lorraine, who had once struggled with homelessness herself decades earlier, saw in Celia not a victim, but a survivor still learning to trust that the storm had truly passed. Marisol, the teenager with guarded eyes and a journal always tucked beneath her arm, started writing again. In the silence of those first nights in the shelter, she filled page after page with reflections, not about loss or hunger, but about what it felt like to be noticed. Her words were raw but full of grace. She wrote of Kamala Harris not as a political figure, but as a woman who had bent her knees on a broken sidewalk and met their gaze without pity. That moment became the anchor in Marisol's writing, the point where despair turned into something less sharp, less endless. She even submitted one of her journal entries to a local youth publication. It was published under the title, "She Knelt for Us." The story caught fire, not as a viral sensation, but as a seed planted deep in the community's soil. Teachers printed the essay and read it aloud in classrooms. Local churches discussed it during youth services. A community college professor asked Marisol, to come speak to her sociology class. Not because she was an expert, but because she had lived the experience that so many students only studied from textbooks. Isaiah, small and wide-eyed, began sleeping through the night again. He laughed more often, sang to himself while brushing his teeth, and asked fewer questions about why their house had burned down. His world had been narrowed to survival for so long that something as simple as having his own pillow felt like a miracle. He didn't understand policy or poverty, but he understood that someone important hadn't noticed him, and that meant the world might not be as cold as it once seemed. Celia, slowly regaining strength in her body and spirit, began attending job readiness classes held at a nearby community center. Each morning, she would dress in donated slacks and a blouse, pull her hair into a neat braid, and walk the 6 blocks with a quiet determination that was more powerful than any speech. The other women in the class admired her composure, unaware of the journey that lay behind her posture. When she was offered a part-time job at a senior care facility 2 weeks later, she nearly collapsed from gratitude. It wasn't just employment, it was dignity. Meanwhile, Kamala's team received periodic updates, not through press briefings, but through letters and quiet reports from the nonprofit organizations now surrounding the family. She read every line with care. She didn't need headlines. She needed truth, the kind that reminded her why she had knelt in the first place. In her speeches across the country, each one carefully crafted to address broader issues like homelessness, education, and economic opportunity, she began to weave in a theme that took root on that Los Angeles sidewalk: the power of presence. She spoke of policy, yes, but always returned to the notion that systems fail not just because they lack funding, but because they lack connection. Programs cannot heal what empathy refuses to touch. Poverty is not just an economic wound. It is emotional erosion, the wearing away of belief that things can ever be different. And sometimes, one pause from a person in power is enough to stop that erosion from becoming permanent. Back in Los Angeles, the ripple continued. A mural appeared near the corner of Jefferson and Avalon, painted on the side of an abandoned warehouse. It depicted a kneeling woman in a dark suit, her hand resting gently on the shoulder of a child who stared forward with eyes full of quiet wonder. Above them, written in swirling gold letters, was a single phrase: "Some see, few stop." The artist had signed the piece anonymously, but locals knew. This wasn't about politics. This was about remembering. Celia and her children visited the mural one afternoon. Isaiah pointed excitedly, recognizing the scene. Marisol took a photo with her mother standing beneath the painted words. Celia didn't smile in the picture, but her eyes shimmered with something deeper than happiness, something like knowing she had survived and that her children had been seen. Across town, in a radio studio nestled in a downtown high-rise, a community broadcaster aired a segment titled "The Stop That Started Something." It featured interviews with outreach workers, volunteers, and social justice advocates who credited that single moment with inspiring dozens of new donors, hundreds of volunteer signups, and a wave of interest in programs supporting displaced families. The story wasn't sensationalized. It didn't need to be. The quietness of it was its strength. Kamala Harris hadn't walked into that lot to be a hero. She had walked into it because something in her soul had refused to let her pass. And that refusal had done more than change one family's fate. It had reminded an entire city of the kind of power that doesn't shout, doesn't demand, and doesn't come wrapped in promises, but that arrives on foot, kneels without fear, and listens without agenda. The weeks passed, but the echo of that quiet moment, a woman stepping out of power's shadow and into humanity's light, did not fade. It grew quieter, yes, as all stories do when their urgency dissolves into memory. Yet beneath the surface, in classrooms, kitchens, and the whispered prayers of mothers watching their children sleep in borrowed beds, that memory remained alive, glowing like an ember that refused to die. It had become more than a headline, more than a talking point or a fleeting viral moment. What Kamala Harris had done on that street corner in South Central Los Angeles had not been about politics. It had been about presence. A presence so rare in public life. It had startled the nation into stillness. From community halls in rural Appalachia to youth shelters in New York City, people spoke of it not because it was loud, but because it was real. The act, so simple in its physical form, yet so radical in its meaning, had sparked a conversation too long avoided. What does it truly mean to see someone? Back in Washington, the pilot program quietly expanded. Without fanfare, it grew into something permanent, its roots sinking deeper into cities and counties that had once written off their most vulnerable. Unlike other initiatives, it wasn't measured solely by spreadsheets and statistics. Its impact was found in smaller moments. The social worker who brought hot soup instead of just a clipboard, the outreach volunteer who stopped asking, "What do you need?" and started saying, "I'm here with you." The program's name, chosen not by committee but by a group of formerly homeless youth, was simple: The Stop. Its mission was equally uncluttered: create space where people are not processed but acknowledged, where human suffering is not solved overnight but witnessed fully, where no one is hurried past simply because they're inconvenient to the flow of traffic or the rhythm of policy. When Kamala stood before a quiet crowd at a community center months later, her voice did not rise with passion. It sank into a softness that carried more weight than any shouting ever could. She spoke not of political victories or legislative hurdles, but of the child who had offered her a wave, the mother who had held her gaze, and the moment when the world seemed to ask her, not as vice president, but as a person, "Will you keep walking or will you stop?" She told the truth, plainly and without adornment. I didn't know what I would say. I just knew I couldn't stay in the car. There was silence after she spoke, not from discomfort, but from reverence. Because deep down, everyone in that room, every teacher, nurse, grandfather, and exhausted single parent, knew exactly what she meant. They had all faced moments when walking past would have been easier, and they had all been waiting, in some way, for someone powerful to choose differently. Celia, the woman who once clutched her son beneath a blue tarp, sat in the audience that day. She wore a soft lavender dress and had her hair pulled into a neat bun. Beside her, Isaiah rested his head on her arm, his legs swinging freely from a chair too tall for his feet. Marisol sat to her other side, her notebook open across her lap, pen poised, as if every word Kamala spoke might become part of something greater, a new story for a new generation. After the event, they didn't rush to greet Kamala. They didn't need to. Their lives had already intersected in a way that words could not deepen. Instead, they walked home slowly, the three of them, beneath a sky just beginning to blush with sunset. No press followed them. No cameras clicked. But as they turned onto their street, a neighbor smiled and waved from across the fence, calling out Marisol's name and asking how her poem was coming along. Another woman offered Celia a ride to work the next morning. Isaiah spotted a boy from his new school and ran ahead to say hello. The community had shifted, not because it had been rescued, but because it had been reminded of its power to rescue each other. Back in her residence that evening, Kamala removed her shoes and poured a glass of water. She sat by the window, the city shimmering below, and let the quiet wrap around her like a well-worn shawl. No music played. No adschaberth. There was nothing urgent to sign, nothing urgent to fix. Only the memory, the stillness, the stop. And within that stillness was the moral that had never needed to be spoken aloud. Sometimes, the smallest action, a single pause, a gentle kneel, a shared gaze, can carry the weight of justice more profoundly than any law. It was not policy that changed the world. It was presence. And if a nation could learn to stop, to truly stop, just once each day, to see someone fully, to listen with both heart and ear, to give without expectation and witness without judgment, then perhaps, slowly, the wound of invisibility that haunts so many would begin to close. Kamala closed her eyes. She saw again the boy's wave, the woman's trembling gratitude, and the sidewalk that had become, for a brief, luminous moment, the most powerful place in America. And in that memory, she smiled, not because everything was better, but because something had begun, something human, something holy, and it had all started the moment she refused to pass by.